Welcome everyone to Straight Science. Straight Science is an evening science presentation series put on by UAF Northwest Campus in Nome and UAF University of Alaska Fairbanks, Alaska Sea Grant, also in Nome, and you're in the office tonight. And tonight, just looking at that first slide right there, the two islands of Diomede, Big and Little Diomede, it doesn't get any more Bering Strait than this. Erica Escajeda is not a newbie to Straight Science. She was here in July of 2020. 21.
Yeah.
I think it was 2020, but well, that's
I
okay.
think so. You're right. Yeah.
All right. And she was talking to us when she was just getting her schooling underway. She was studying fin whales. She gave us a little taste of her research, which was very interesting. And before I forget, because I just remembered, I did want to say that Northwest Campus and Alaska Sea Grant, we are both public servants of the Bering Strait region. We serve all peoples of the Bering Strait region, which includes the homelands and waters of the Inupiaq, Yupik, and St. Lawrence Island Yupik peoples. So with that, I was saying that Erica gave us her first taste of her research back in a few years ago, and she was talking to us solely about fin whales. And she's been using underwater microphones to kind of eye spy the whales from underneath and hear them calling and talking as they go through. I'm sure there's other kinds of microphones all over the place in the Bering Strait region, but for Erica, she's listening to the whales. So with that, she is a newly minted PhD. It said PhD candidate. She is University of Washington School of Aquatic and Fishery Sciences, but she's a candidate no longer. She got her PhD, so she is Dr. Escajeda. And so congratulations to that. And thank you for coming back to Straight Science and giving us the full story of your research in the Bering Strait region on our subarctic, or the more southern baleen whales. What's happening? What's going on? And are they visitors truly with the changes that are upon us, or are they coming home? With that, I'll turn it over to you, Erica, and take it away. Thank you so much for coming.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be with you and to share my research with you all. Without further ado, I'll get started. Always a toggle. So my research is I'm really interested in the Pacific Arctic and how it's changing and how those changes affect animals that live in the Pacific Arctic. And you probably don't need any orientation, but when I say the Pacific Arctic, I mean the area covered by the Bering Sea to the south, the Chukchi and Beaufort Sea to the north, separated by the Bering Strait in the center. And so this region is controlled by the annual cycle of sea ice melt and formation. So ice melting in the spring, forming in the fall. If we just pay attention to the star here, I'll show you the monthly sea ice extent for this past year. And so you can see that the sea ice completely retreats from the Chukchi Sea in the summertime and then forms again all the way down, hopefully, to the Bering Sea in the wintertime. And so this one characteristic really drives productivity and variability in the environment of this region. And as you're all very much aware, the Chukchi Sea is quickly changing. Sea ice extent is declining, as you can see in this plot, comparing the minimum maximum extents for the 70s, 80s compared to 2008 to 2017. So extent is way down. Sea ice is melting earlier in the spring and forming later in the fall. And this has largely to do with the fact that ocean temperatures are warming. As you can see in this plot of sea surface temperature anomalies for the month of August, over the past 40 years, it's slowly creeping upwards. And so there's a lot of concern about how these changes in tandem are going to affect animals that call the Pacific Arctic home, such as the species you see here. But what I was really interested in finding out is how are these changes affecting subarctic baleen whales that come to the Chukchi Sea, and how are they reacting to these changes? And so when I say subarctic baleen whales, what I mean are baleen whales that come to the Chukchi Sea only seasonally. They typically migrate through the area in late spring, early summer, stay, feed for that time, and then migrate through the Bering Strait in the fall. So they don't spend the entire year in the Chukchi Sea, which is why they're considered subarctic. And the three species that I was interested in are fin whales, humpback whales, and gray whales. And so when we ask this question, how are subarctic whales reacting to changes in their habitat? The answer is a bit complicated for these three species because all three of these species are wide ranging. And so here's just an image of the range for fin whales. And as you can see, fin whales in the North Pacific can be found all over. They typically are in more temperate waters north of 30 degrees latitude, or sorry, north of 30 degrees north and then south of 30 degrees in the southern hemisphere. They're also highly migratory, as we can see in this plot of migratory movements of a satellite tagged gray whale. So this individual was tagged on the southern tip of Baja California. They then swam alongside the western coast of Baja California in February, migrating along the California, Oregon, Washington coast in March, Alaska in April. They spent some time in around Kodiak Islands, then completing the summer migration through Unamik Pass to the Chirikov Basin in around May through July, after which the tags stopped transmitting. So you can see these animals cover wide ranges of areas before they get to the Chukchi Sea. So when we're thinking about how to use reactions of their occurrence patterns and thinking about how they could be reacting to changes. They could be reacting to changes all along their migratory pathway. So thirdly, it's also complicated because there are generalist predators. So fin and humpback whales are pelagic predators. They mostly target swarms of krill, but they'll also target schools of forage fish as well as juvenile pollock. On the other hand, gray whales are benthic foragers, and you can see this image of a gray whale surfacing, has a big mud plume behind it. This individual is coming up to breathe after foraging and is filtering mud through its baleen. And so these critters mostly target amphipods, but they'll also take any kind of benthic invertebrates such as mice and shrimp and polychaete worms as well. And I'm going to hide these meeting controls real quick just so they don't pop up. And so what I was really interested in, this paper came out right about when I started my my master's, actually, way back in the day. But this 2013 paper asked the question of whether or not increased sightings of subarctic whales, such as fin whales and humpback whales, was a sign of their recovery after whaling or a response to changing ecosystem. And so this paper by Janet Clark and collaborators looked at both visual data, which you can see here in the southern Chukchi Sea, as well as acoustic data, and found that humpback whales and fin whales were increasing. And then again, in 2018, another paper by Amelia Brower and collaborators used aerial survey data, the aerial survey of Arctic marine mammals data set, and found that, again, fin whales and humpback whales were increasing in their sightings data. And just as a side note, most of their effort was concentrated in the Beaufort Sea and Northeast Chukchi Sea, with some lines around Point Hope area. And so when they said that these sightings of these animals were increasing, they were comparing that to a data set taken in the 80s that was mostly concentrated in the months of September and October, but not really the summer months. Whereas this study looked at summer months as well and saw far more of these animals. So it probably depends on when you're looking for subarctic whales as well as where you're looking for them. And in fact, we know from historical observations that both fin and humpback whales historically were found north of the Bering Strait area. And we know this from observations of both Soviet and Japanese whalers that were operating the area in the 20th century. And as you can see, most of the pre-1970 fin and humpback whale observations were on the Russian side of the Pacific Arctic, specifically off the coast of Chukotka. And then over time, over the 20th century, observations of either fin and humpback whales became increasingly rare. And then after 1960, they were barely seen at all. And you can see in this plot of humpback whale observations for this region that there used to be hundreds of humpback whales seen north of the strait. And then by the 1950s, 60s, there was only tens. And this largely has to do with the fact that both fin and humpback whales were heavily targeted by commercial whalers all throughout the 20th century. Estimates of 49,000 fin whales and 28,000 humpback whales were taken from the North Pacific alone during this time. And so this had a huge impact on their populations. And so with the moratorium on whaling that took effect in 1986, both populations of fin whales and humpback whales have been recovering in the North Pacific. And again, there's recent sightings have noticed a pattern of interannual variability in the presence of these whales in the Chukchi Sea. Again, this paper by Janet Clark, you can see that just looking at their visual sightings per year, that in 2012, there were far more humpback whales seen in their study region than the previous years. And that was the same for fin whales as well. There was another study that came out that same year by Julian Delarue that used hydrophones, so underwater microphones, to look at fin whale calls. And at a point just northwest of Cape Lisburne, they saw far more fin whale calls in 2007 than 2009 and 2010. And for gray whales, a paper that just came out last year by Sue Moore, she saw that there were far fewer gray whale detections in 2018 for a point southwest of Point Hope than there were the previous years. And so then the question became, well, why is that? What draws Subarctic Baleen whales into the Chukchi Sea in some years and not in others? And so for this effort, I used acoustic data, but why use acoustic data? Well, first of all, whales only spend about 10 to 20%, if you're lucky, of their lives at the surface. And so it's really hard to observe them. Also, the Arctic can be a very difficult place to work. It is often foggy, ice covered, stormy. We can't be there year round. And so instead we use instruments such as this hydrophone that you see here to do the data collection for us. And so this is the hydrophone that I used. It's an Oral M2 hydrophone. It's huge. It's mostly consists of batteries and 2 big batteries and a hard drive. And it's attached to a mooring, which is a chain of instruments that take all different kinds of data for us. And that's anchored to the seafloor using an old train wheel. And so the hydrophone can collect data for us, which is a huge advantage. But probably most importantly, sound is important to whales. And so we're able to use sound, and they make a lot of sound. And so we're able to use sound to study their presence and absence because each species emits unique vocalizations. And so hopefully my audio will play for you. But so out of the 3 species, humpback whales had the highest diversity of calls, ranging anywhere from very short whoops, like this one. I'll play that again for you. To
Erica, this is Gate. It's really hard. I don't know if you can pump up the volume on that or
it's very soft.
Very soft, yeah.
Okay, maybe let's try this one.
Much better.
Okay, yeah, those other calls are kind of hard to hear. So yeah, that humpback whales make all kinds of sounds, which instantly endeared me to them because they make studying their vocalizations far more exciting. On the other hand, we have gray whales. Gray whales don't make as much sound. It was actually thought for the longest time that they were the quote silent whale until they discovered that they do make calls, in fact, really funny calls. So this is the S1 call. It kind of sounds like someone knocking on a door. Let's see if you can hear this one. And looks like I can turn up the volume. So let's see if this works. Hopefully that was good. But yeah, it just sounds like kind of like a bongo. But they don't make that call as much. That's thought to be associated with breeding. Instead, they tend to make more low moan calls like this M3 call, which if you listen to it, just sounds like distant thunder. Very low moan. And so that call is mostly made when the whales are migrating, and it's thought that maybe they make those low calls in order to avoid detection by killer whales. And then fin whales make some of the lowest sounds that we know of in the animal kingdom. And I would play it for you, but it's so hard to hear. It almost just sounds like electrical interference. Of course, the drawback with using acoustic data is that you can only detect vocal individuals. And so if a whale's not calling, we don't know it's there. And so for my research, I was really interested in investigating patterns in acoustic presence of all 3 species in the Bering Strait during the open water season, and also quantifying how their acoustic habitat is changing with increased use by ships. And so I broke this into 2 parts. Part 1 was to investigate the acoustic currents of all 3 whales and look at what drivers could explain their variability in their presence, as well as examine migration timing. And for this, I used data from May through December for 10 years of data, 2009 to 2018. For part 2, I quantified the impact of ship noise for the Bering Strait region, specifically for June through November, for using 3 years of data. And so, but before we start thinking about what drives patterns and whale occurrence, it's kind of helpful to think about what drives patterns of productivity in the Chukchi Sea. And as I introduced you to in the earliest slide, sea ice is the primary driver of productivity and shapes productivity for the whole region. And so thinning of the sea ice in spring is what initiates the bloom of both underwater ice, under ice phytoplankton, as well as ice algae. And then when the sea ice completely retreats, you have an open water bloom, as you can see in the satellite image of the Bering Sea taken in April of 1998. Also, in addition to the sea ice, productivity is just driven by distinct water masses, which you can think of as currents that have different temperature and salinity properties. And so in the Bering Strait, we have 3 main water masses. We have the anadir water, which is cold and very salty. This is a water mass that is brought up from the depths of the Bering Sea shelf and up onto the shallow continental shelves of the northern Bering Sea. And so it has a lot of nutrients. It's very cold and salty. And so because it has a lot of nutrients, it tends to have large plankton associated with it. In the center of the strait, we have the Bering Shelf water, which is also cold and salty and tends to have large plankton. And on the eastern side, we have the Alaskan coastal water, which is fed by a bunch of rivers, and thus tends to be warmer and fresher and has smaller plankton. And so all 3 water masses create a gradient of productivity across the Bering Strait, which makes it a really interesting place to work. And I used data from 3 oceanographic moorings, which were positioned to measure these water masses. So the location of A3 was chosen to measure the confluence of the anadir water and Bering Shelf water. A2 is located in the eastern channel of the Bering Strait, and it mostly measures the Bering Shelf water. Then just east of that, we have the A4, which is mostly measuring the Alaskan coastal water. And so what's important about these water masses is because they're mostly flowing northward, they deliver not only nutrients, but also phytoplankton, zooplankton, forage fish species from the Pacific Ocean into the Chukchi Sea. And so productivity in this region is driven by advection of those water masses through the strait. So for part 1, I used data from A3 mooring only, and that's mostly because when I looked at this data set earlier, I saw more whale detections at A3 than A2 and A4. Also, A2 and A4, the hydrophones were taken offline in 2017, so I didn't have as much data for those. So we'll just focus on A3. And for this, I asked, when do the whales arrive in the Bering Strait in the spring, and when do they leave in the fall? Are there any trends over time? Are the arrival and departure dates influenced by environmental conditions? Secondly, what factors influence the probability of a calling whale being present during the open water season, which I define as May through December? And so for each of the parts, I'll show you a little cartoon of the data collection schematic. And so at A3, the mooring sits in 56 meters of water. It's very shallow. And we have our string of instruments which collect different environmental variables for us. At 40 meters depth, we have a temperature and salinity sensor, which I'll nickname the near bottom temperature and salinity sensor. This is housed together with acoustic Doppler current profiler water speed sensor that takes water speeds for the 30-meter depth fin. And here's what that instrument looks like in real life. It gets heavily biofouled by barnacles, mussels, and all kinds of critters. At 6 meters depth, we have our hydrophone, which had different sampling regimes and was programmed to turn on every hour and record the first 10 to 20 minutes of that hour. And so using the acoustic recordings, I quantified whale presence as the proportion of recordings per day with vocalizations present. So there were 24 recordings per day, and I looked at how many of those recordings had whale calls present and quantified and then calculated the proportion. So in addition to temperature and salinity data, we had sea surface temperature data, which I took from satellite-derived products, and also wind direction and speed, which I took from the North American Regional Reanalysis products, which I then averaged, over 4 data points around A3. Next, I was also interested in looking at the presence of fronts, because we know fronts make really good feeding habitat for whales elsewhere in the world's ocean. So I was interested.
Erica, can you tell us what a front is? I get that A3 is where your microphone is for the listening to the whales as they pass, so you can get an idea of how many and when.
Yeah.
What's a front? Very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah. So a front, you can have multiple kinds of fronts, but mostly we think of them mostly the fronts that were interested were thermal fronts. And so it's where basically a front, very basically, is where two water masses with different properties meet. And in this case, we have a cold front or a cold water mass here on the western side of A3 and a warmer front on the eastern side. And so here's a map of sea surface temperatures right here. So you can see that there are vastly different temperatures right next to each other. And what that does is that because there's different water masses of different properties, it kind of creates a trap, which traps plankton and attracts forage fish to feed on those zooplankton, which then attract other predators to feed at those areas. So they make for really good feeding habitat. And so as you can see, A3, sometimes there seems to be a thermal front that forms around A3. And so what I did was I drew a 30-kilometer buffer around the mooring site. And I chose 30 kilometers because I took from the literature to that number as the maximum range that we could detect whales. So if a whale was within 30 kilometers, we hypothesized that we would be able to detect it with our hydrophones. And so then I calculated the maximum change in sea surface temperatures within that buffer to see whether or not a front was present. So if you have a really big change between neighboring grid cells within that buffer, that could indicate the presence of a thermal front. And so on to the results. I'll show you plots of the daily proportions of recordings with whale calls. And so we have humpback whales, fin whales, and gray whales at the bottom. And so the proportions are, 0 to 1, 1 being 100% of recordings that day had whale calls present. And then this gray shading here indicates when the hydrophone wasn't recording. Could be because the battery was dead, the hard drive failed, or whatnot. And so immediately you can see that there does seem to be both so within the year, and between year variability in the presence of these whales. Humpback whales were the most commonly recorded species. Not too surprising there, given how many vocalizations they emit during the summertime. And then if we look between the years, I'll draw your attention to, for humpback whales, 2009, 17, 18 had the highest proportion of recordings with humpback whale calls compared to the other years. For fin whales, the years to stand out are 2015, 17, 18 as being high abundance years for fin whales, whereas gray whales were kind of heard in low abundance throughout the open water season. However, 2018 really stands out as a year that had consistent detections of gray whale calls. Some other things to note, as you can see with this big chunk of gray, unfortunately, our hydrophone failed to record in 2016. So we were left with only 9 years of data for looking at departure dates in fall. Also, we only had spring recordings for 4 of the years, which really wasn't a good enough sample size to look at trends and arrival dates. So we'll really just focus on the departure dates. So for the departure dates, so when the whales left the area, I quantified this as the 95% quantile of days with whale calls for the 9 years that had fall data. And so I'll show you a plot of day of the year with November and December marked so you can see where the points fall in relation to these months. Again, there wasn't fall data for 2016. And so humpbacks over our study period were typically the first to leave the Bering Strait region. Their departure dates range from late October to early November. 2017-18 were kind of weird years. Fin whales followed soon after with departure dates typically in early November to mid-November. And then gray whales, at least historically, were the last to leave out of the 3 species with departure dates in late November. And then if we look at trends, I found a significant trend in later departure dates for fin whales. So fin whales over our study period were leaving on average 3 days later per year over the course of our study. And this was significant. Humpbacks also had an increasing trend in the departure dates. However, this was not significant. And so I just want to highlight 2018 was a crazy year. I've been looking at fin whales for a long time. I always thought they left in November. And then I added 2018, I was scanning, and I was seeing humpback whales and fin whale calls well into late November. And just it was shocking to see fin whale calls well into December. I think the departure date was December 3rd for that year. So then the question became why. So I looked at the departure dates in comparison to seasonal average temperatures for winter, spring, summer, and fall. And so we have sea surface temperatures at the top, bottom temperatures on the bottom, plotted against departure day of the year. And then each of the points has a different color depending on the year. And so you can see that both sea surface temperature and bottom temperatures had a significant positive relationship with departure dates for humpback whales. So humpback whales left the Bering Strait and later in years that had warmer temperatures at both the surface and the near bottom. Next, we'll look at fin whales, and you can see that again, the relationship is very similar, very strong, positive, significant relation. This is correlation here, so you can see that it's strongly correlated. And really, if we focus on the only difference here is that there's no significant for summer in the sea surface temperatures. And so if we look, we can see that 2017 and 18 are really driving this trend. And so it'd be really interesting to look at later years and see if this trend has continued, if they're continuing to stay later in the Bering Strait. And so from this, I concluded that fin and humpback whales delayed their southward migration in years that had warmer water temperatures. So next, looking at, I was interested in exploring potential temporal and environmental covariates associated with the probability of observing whale calls on a given day during the open water season. And so for this, I looked at time of the year represented by day of the year, as well as environmental conditions at the mooring at the same time the whales were detected. So bottom temperature and salinity, sea surface temperatures, wind speed and direction, water speed, as well as that daily and lagged by 1 month presence of a thermal front, which I nicknamed the SST gradient. And of course, I didn't want any correlation between my explanatory variables, so I removed variables with correlation greater than 0.7. And I encountered an issue when I was thinking about which model to use. The issue was I had correlation in my response variable. So a calling whale is more likely to be present in an hour or a day, where a calling whale was present the previous hour or the day, right? Like you can think of a whale that's just sitting there calling for hours and hours, which they tend to do. It's probably likely that if you had a whale 1 hour, you might see that same whale the second hour. So I had correlation in my response variable. So my solution for this was to use the beta binomial distribution. So the advantage with the beta binomial distribution is that unlike the binomial distribution, the beta binomial distribution does not assume that your Bernoulli outcomes, so that presence absence for each hour, were independent from each other. It's fine if they were correlated. And the way that the distribution accounts for correlation is it fits the overdispersion parameter, which is this symbolized by sigma, in addition to our response variable, which was the probability of a call being present on a given day. And so I fit the same covariates to both the probability P as well as the overdispersion parameter. And I selected my best models using the Ikiki information score criterion score with a correction for small sample sizes. And so in the interest of time, I'll just show you the variables that were selected by all 3 species models. And when dealing with these complex general additive smoothing fit models, you can't really look at the coefficients from these models and interpret the effect of the explanatory variables using those coefficients alone. Instead, you use plots of the additive smoothing fits. And so these plots here, the y-axis is unitless. And what you want to pay attention to is this relative direction of this curve, so this black line here. And so this indicates the effect of the explanatory variable on the probability of calling whale being present. And so for fin whales, we have increasing probability of a fin whale being present as day of the year increases, peaking around the 27th of October and then declining thereafter. For humpback whales, so here's that plot again for fin whales. For humpback whales, the story is similar, although the peak is far more prominent. You have increasing probability of a humpback whale being present as the day of the year approaches late October, sharply decreasing thereafter. Gray whales did not have a relationship with day of the year, as you can see by this flat line decreasing trend here. And so from this, because we saw more fin and humpback whales in detections in September and October, I thought this is likely due to the fact that males of these species tend to increase their vocalization rates in anticipation of the approaching winter breeding season. So humpbacks are starting to sing, fin whales are starting to sing, and they're starting to get ready for the breeding season, in which they sing a lot. The other variables that were selected by the models were temperatures. So both the sea surface temperature and the near bottom temperature were selected by all 3 species models. And so for fin whales, we saw that the probability of a fin whale being present peaked around 1 to 5 degrees Celsius in the surface temperatures. There was a peak between like 5 to 6 degrees Celsius in the near bottom. For humpback whales, the probability of a calling humpback whale being present increased with increasing sea surface temperatures that you can see here. There's 2 peaks in the near bottom, so a peak around 1 degree Celsius and 5 degrees Celsius in the near bottom, when a calling humpback whale would be more likely to be present. For gray whales, there were 2 peaks in the sea surface temperatures, one around 1 degree and one around 7 degrees Celsius, whereas the probability increased with increasing near bottom temperatures. Finally, looking at the lagged presence of a thermal gradient were selected by all 3 species. However, the relationship was different with this lagged sea surface temperature gradient. For both fin whales and humpback whales, the probability of a calling whale being present increased with a stronger gradient, so towards 3 degrees Celsius. That peak was a little bit sharper for humpback whales, again, around 3 degrees Celsius. So that could indicate a relationship with the presence of a front the previous month. Whereas for gray whales, it doesn't seem like they had a strong relationship with the strong fronts. Instead, if there was a small change in sea surface temperatures, then calling gray whales were more likely to be present. So it's not really clear that a front at A3 would be important for gray whales in the previous month. So what can we conclude from all of this? Well, all three species were present in the Bering Strait throughout the open water season. There was some year-to-year variability. Fin and humpback whales have a strong seasonal pattern in their vocalizations, with more calls heard in fall. Both fin and humpback whales had later departure dates. However, the trend was only significant for fin whales. Both species delayed their southward migration in years with warmer temperatures. And the water temperatures, lack presence of a thermal front, as well as day of the year were drivers of acoustic presence for all three species. So next, how does the presence of ship noise affect their acoustic habitat?
So Erica, is it all right if
Yeah.
we ask questions here at part
Sure.
one?
Yeah.
All right. I mean, everybody can ask questions at the end too, but I just wanted to see if at this point anyone has any questions. I know I have one.
Yeah.
And that is, so what you're saying is from the microphone that's set sort of north of Diomede, and you're listening in so that, and using the mathematics and the call data that you have, so the water temperature, lined up nicely with the arrival, with the timeliness of the fin whale and the humpback whale, but not so much the gray whale. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah.
Oh.
And it's departure.
Oh, that's right. I'm sorry. They're leaving and going,
Yeah.
they're headed for Diomede and further parts further south, St. Lawrence Island and whatnot, and on their way to Hawaii in some cases. So, and where is the fin whale headed?
The
Does-
fin whale, we don't know. We don't
Oh,
know where
okay.
this, yeah,
So
where
it's
they breed.
wintering somewhere south.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay.
South. There are fin whales that spend the winter in Bering Sea, as well as the Gulf of Alaska. So, but I don't think it has not been shown whether they're having their babies there. So that could be just individuals that are not breeding who then stay in those temperate areas during the winter time, but where they have their calves, we don't know. They might not have the same kind of pattern as gray whales and humpback whales, where they all convene on the same location to have their babies. And that's thought mostly, well, there are a few hypotheses, but I think the most convincing one is that they like to go to the same areas, these really shallow tropical areas, in order to avoid predation by killer whales. So,
Okay.
but fin whales being the second largest animal on Earth, don't have that problem as much. So maybe they don't need to convene in shallow areas to have their babies.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yeah. Any more questions?
Let's see. Nope, but there's a good comment from Orland. I've seen some kind of whales out there in our open waters, and the ice went out fast. And I'm guessing that's now. Orland, you're seeing whales as the ice is going out.
Yeah, out in the shore, near the shore, saw some kind of whales. I couldn't make out what they were.
Oh, cool.
Big or
Yeah.
small, you think?
Small, maybe small, medium size.
Yeah.
They were right behind the waves near the shore.
All right.
Oh,
Cool
yeah.
beans. Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah, very cool. I mean, maybe gray whales. They're definitely. I see their calls about this time. So
Okay. Cool.
yeah.
All righty. Well, we'll
Okay.
hear part 2 if you're ready. Thank you so
Okay.
much.
Yeah, let's do it. Okay, so on to part 2. So I was really interested in looking at the issue of shipping in the Bering Strait region. And so as the ice is disappearing, it's opening up new shipping routes in the Arctic, including, the Northwest Passage along the Canadian archipelago coast and the Beaufort Sea, Northern Sea route, which goes along the coast of Russia, and the transpolar route. But all three of these proposed routes, and the Northern Sea route is very active at this point. All three of these routes go through the Bering Strait region. So making this area a really important region for looking at vessel traffic. And a study by the Ocean Conservancy found that vessel counts over a period between 2008 to 2018 increased 150%. And that trend is predicted to just continue to increase every year. And so I was really interested in looking at ship activity and quantifying ship noise for the Bering Strait region for the open water season. And so for this, I characterized ship activity for June through November 2013 through 15. And so I used automatic identification system data from the US Coast Guard. So this, ships over large ships over 300 gross tons need to carry transponders. Passenger ships over 100 gross tons and carrying more than 12 passengers have to carry this. So the AIS data set from the US Coast Guard is all from land-based receivers, and the data set is not really good for looking at the presence of smaller vessels because they don't carry transponders. And so really it was only good for looking at larger vessels, but it's freely available, which is really nice. And so using this AIS data, I plotted the ship tracks, which you can see in this inset here, and I drew a buffer around A3 and A2 out to 100 kilometers. And so any vessels that were within this 100 kilometers, I took as transiting the Bering Strait region and counted them as being within the Bering Strait. And so I identified each ship using their unique maritime mobile service identity number. And I summed all the unique ships that I saw by vessel type, which was provided by the AIS dataset, month and year. So my second objective was to quantify the contribution of ship noise to sound levels in frequency bands that are used by baleen whales. So baleen whales tend to make sounds within the 25 to 1,000 hertz band. And when I say frequency, I mean like pitch. So high frequency, low frequency. So 25 is very, very low frequency. And so I identified recordings with ship noise using my hydrophone. And for this study, I only use recordings from A2 and A4. And that's because, as you can see in this map, most of the ships went through the Bering Strait region and then scattered. So they weren't really picked up by my A3 mooring. So then once I had the recordings, I matched the recordings with the moving vessel within 10 kilometers of the mooring. And I organized the ship recordings into categories based on daily average wind and water speeds. And the reason why I did that is because the Bering Strait is so narrow, you have water moving through the region, which can cause the instruments to strum on the mooring, which can create noise. And so I really wanted to make sure that I was just isolating the ship noise and taking wind and any noise created by wind and water speed into account. And so for winds, if there were on days that had winds with less than 10 knots, I categorized as low wind recordings, again, using that North American reanalysis product for the wind data. And then days with water speeds less than 40 centimeters per second were considered low water days. So any recordings taken on that day were in the low water category. And then I compared the median sound pressure levels, so basically the median sound levels when a ship was present, to ambient sound levels that were recorded on days that had similar conditions, wind and water speeds, as that day that the ship was recorded. My third objective was to then look at the spatial impact of ship noise in the Bering Strait. And so for this, I measured the sound levels at each of these transmission points. So there's one transmission point per minute in the AIS data set. And I quantified the sound levels as the root mean square pressure for the 250 hertz third octave frequency bands. And so that when I say third octave frequency band, that's basically summing up the intensity or how loud a sound is for a particular frequency band. So it's a nice way of thinking about how loud a sound is for a small range of frequencies around 250 hertz. The reason why I chose 250 hertz was that I found that sound levels measured for this band were less likely to be contaminated by flow noise caused by that strumming that I told you about with the mooring. And so then I removed background noise to isolate sound levels produced by the ship. And then I measured the slant range between the mooring and each of these transmission points, so I could get distance between the ship and the recorder. And then I plotted the receive levels versus distance to recorder for the loudest ships that I observed. So now looking at the results, I'll show you the ship activity during the open water season for the 3 years that I looked at. And as you can see, the peak in shipping activity occurred in the summer, so July through September, with 2013 having the highest number of unique vessels identified. But what was interesting is that I had far more recordings with ship noise than I had observations of ships in the area. And that just goes to show you that the AIS data are not entirely, they don't include all the ships that are going through the area. There are probably a lot of ships that didn't have their transponders on. And so from 2013, I had 93 days with ship noise recorded. That increased to 131 days by 2015. So we saw an increase in the days with ship noise over the study period. I observed the highest overlap between ship noise and whale vocalizations in October. And I saw that cargo ships were the most common vessel type. So about a third of all vessels were cargo ships, followed by tugs, vessels labeled as other, and tankers. And here's some of the images of vessels that were identified in the AIS data set as having transited through the Bering Strait region. So you can see a lot of tugs, smaller cargo ships. And so next, looking at ship noise versus ambient sound levels to see how much ships raise ambient sound levels. I'll show you the days with low wind and water speeds comparison to the days with high wind and high water speeds. And on the y-axis, we have median sound levels. So basically the intensity or how loud the sound was in decibels. And then on the x-axis, we have that frequency bands. And so you can see that on really calm days, that ship recordings they had far higher sound levels than ambient recordings. And so the average was a 7 decibel difference with a range between 2 to 15 decibel difference. If we look at the high wind and the days with high wind and water speeds, you can see that difference is reduced. And it really depends on which frequency band you're looking at. So you can see that the lower frequency bands, the ambient and ship noise are about the same. So wind and water speed, high wind and high water speeds do contribute a lot of noise that were perceived by the recorders at those frequency bands. But then you can see that the higher frequency bands did have a difference where ships were contributing on average 3 decibels of noise to the ambient sound levels. And then next, looking at the spatial impact of ship noise, I'll show you a plot of those receive levels. So again, those receive levels at each point along the track of the ship. So we have the 250 hertz receive levels on the y-axis, distance to recorder in kilometers on the x-axis. Each of these gray dots will be the sound levels from a transmission associated with the transmission of a ship. So it shows you where that ship was in space and how loud of sound we were receiving from that ship. And then each of the icons, so I'll show you the loudest ships, and they're symbolized by the vessel type. So here you can see that the 8 loudest vessels were producing sounds over 100 decibels, well beyond their immediate vicinity. In fact, the loudest ship, an other ship, was producing sounds well above 100 decibels out to about 6 miles away from that ship. So you can see that ships have an outsized impact on sound levels well beyond their immediate vicinity. And so from this, we saw that recordings with ship noise increased over the 3-year period that we looked at. Ships were a major contributor of noise during the open water season. And so on calm days, that difference was far more noticeable, so 7 decibel difference. And so just to kind of give you a sense of what decibels, so If you have a change of 3 decibels, that means it's double the amount of loudness or that intensity. And so 7 is even higher. So this may seem small, but it's quite loud, especially on calm days. And then importantly, the peak and ship activity overlaps with the migration of subarctic baleen whales through the strait. And so it's very important for ship operators to be aware of this fact and avoid interactions with whales. And so the final takeaways that I had from conducting all this research is that all 3 species migrate through the Bering Strait each year. And I am convinced that this year-to-year variability in the detections and the acoustic data is likely tied to spatial variability in where the whales are. So if a whale decides to feed elsewhere and it's not within range, you're not going to see it. It also depends on what route they take for their migration. So maybe they swim up the Eastern Channel in springtime, but then they migrate through the Western Channel in the fall. And so if they're out of detection range, then we don't see them. So it would be interesting to add more recorders and get a better spatial coverage and see kind of where they're going. All 3 species, though, are important components of the summer ecosystem of the southern Chukchi Sea. And this is really important when thinking about climate change and mitigation of anthropogenic activity in this region. We need to be thinking of these species when we think of those conservation activities. And then the ship noise results that I presented here, I hope that they can serve for baseline for measuring future changes to the Bering Strait soundscape. And in terms of like future research, I think it'd be really interesting to look at the presence of fronts again. I'm convinced that the location and strength of fronts likely drives variation in the presence of these whales. If we revisit that paper by Janet Clark in 2013, you can see that they saw a lot of humpback whales right around Point Hope. And if we again look at our image of sea surface temperatures, you can see that seems to be a change in sea surface temperatures right about where they saw those humpback whales. So humpback whales could be feeding at that front. And so any variation in the presence of that front, the location of that front could then drive the presence of these whales. Also, the study that I conducted took place over a decade of significant change for the Pacific Arctic. In the earlier years of the study period, there was sea ice in the Bering Sea in April. And then 2017 and 18, the story completely changed with no sea ice in the Bering Sea in spring. And this has cascading implications on the food web of the region. And so it's really important that we continue monitoring these species. And so it's important to continue monitoring the presence of subarctic baleen whales in order to understand how ice loss and increased anthropogenic activity will affect them. And I think we have a lot to learn from these animals that can then tell us what's happening also to their prey. And so with that, I would love to acknowledge all the people who made this research possible, including a shout out to the Norseman 2, the crew of that vessel who help us deploy and recover these moorings each summer. And I would love to take any questions.
All right. Well, wow, Erica, there was a lot there for me to unpack in my head.
Yeah,
I'll tell you
yeah.
that. So I would say I could see why you earned your PhD. So very good. And thank you so much. Lots to think on that. We do have a caller on the line. And before we start questions, this is a time to put in your comments and questions, or think about what questions you want to ask to Erica about the movements of fin, gray, and humpback whales. I got a lot of questions, but maybe some others will ask, but the caller gets precedent. Caller, we see you on. And it's very difficult to be a caller on a Zoom call because you can't jump up and down or do the emojis and all that. So if you have any question, caller, you just unmute and ask away. And if you're having trouble unmuting, my cell phone is 907-434-1149. We have had some problems with Zoom. Letting people out, I think you're supposed to press *6 or whatever you've got at your end of things. But if you're having trouble and you do have a question, you can text or call 907-434-1149. So we're glad you stuck with it. So any questions right off the bat? Then I'll jump right in. Oh, Orland, go ahead. I see you trying to unmute. I'm too quick on the draw.
Oh no, I just want to say thanks, and that was interesting. First
Oh,
time.
good.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks for coming.
Go ahead, Austin. I see your hand is up. Hook? No?
Nope,
Oh,
but this is
try
open.
to unmute. Sorry.
Okay, we got two going. Austin, I saw you first. Sorry, Opik. Can you hold?
Yeah, sorry. Opik, I wasn't quick enough with the unmute.
Okay.
Just a quick question. So the Porter Gnome is expected to expose marine mammals to up to 200 decibels of sounds from sheet pile impact driving over a 7-year period. What would you have any opinions on how that might affect these 3 species you looked at?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I know when I started this, I was really interested in looking at sound propagation around my recorders. And the trouble that I encountered was, in order to do really robust analyses of how far out that sound propagates beyond the sound source, you need to have good data on how sound travels through the medium, including how sound travels through the sediment. And because that can affect how much sound reaches your animals. And there wasn't, at least for my region, really good data on that to look at how far out that the sound travels. And so the best I can do was that the showing the receive levels over space, and that's just the receive levels that I'm receiving on the hydrophone. And that was like, over 110, between 110 and 100 decibels, and out to 6 miles for the loudest ships. And so, 200, I wonder, where is that being measured? Is that measured pretty close to the sound source or far away? Do you know?
So it's totally estimated. There are no site-specific data. They're extrapolating what they know from installation of sheet pile with a hammer drill, or impact hammer, large impact hammer. But they suspect at least, or at the high end, 200 decibels over 7-year period. At the low end, 120 decibels.
Yeah, at the low end, 120. So yeah, it'd be interesting to see more data on how far out if they've done the propagation modeling to look at how far out those elevated sound levels are, and then look at whale movements within that region to see, because for me, I'm just seeing whales go through the strait, but I don't really know where they go after or where they've been before. And so it was interesting. If I had recordings that went the whole hour, so I can see the passage of a ship and how the whales reacted acoustically, I think that would be really interesting. But because it was cut off at 10 minutes, 20 minutes, I wasn't able to see that entire interaction. There were recordings where I saw whale calls and ship noise at the same time, and the whales just continued vocalizing no matter what. And so they didn't seem too bothered. But yeah, with the pile driving, I would hope that they would do some kind of a bubble masking, where they set up a bubbler to create sound interference for that, so that sound doesn't propagate beyond that bubble net. I would have to kind of refresh my memory of how much sound is reduced beyond that, and if that would be really effective. But I hope they're at least considering that for that construction project.
They are not.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah.
All right.
Yeah. Good question.
Thank you.
Thank you, Austin. And for that kind of, would it be helpful, Erica, then, if you have something like that going on in the Port of Nome, to have recorders? Would that help be able to sort of get at?
Oh, yes.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah,
Right.
I think
Interesting.
the acoustic monitoring would be very important. Well, yeah, before it'd be nice to just have some recorders and see who's there,
It's normal. Yeah.
what's normal. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Opik, I didn't mean to cut you short there. You had a
That's
question?
okay.
Yeah.
That's okay. Hi, Erica. Thank you.
Hi, Opik.
Yeah, good to hear you again.
Yeah, nice to see
Yep.
you.
Yep. So my question is, there's a couple actually. And I cut out because I'm here on Diomede and we don't
Mm.
have working DSL and don't have long distance. I'm using Starlink right now, and it keeps cutting off. So I missed a few. I can review recording later on. So you talked about phytoplankton. You mentioned small and large phytoplankton. Can you
Mhm.
tell me what do you mean exactly?
Yeah. So, that was kind of with regards to the water masses, and so with the cooler temperatures, you see more large chain forming diatoms in the phytoplankton compared to like smaller unicellular phytoplankton in the warmer waters. And then also temperature is important for copepods, so you see
Zooplankton.
yeah, for the zooplankton. So for copepods, you see more of those fatty calinous copepods in the colder waters and smaller species in the warmer waters. So that's kind of what typically what you see with those water masses.
Okay. And then thanks for that. And with your hydrophone, what type of hydrophone are you using?
Yeah, so these are oral AURAL M2 hydrophones. And they're huge. Like I could not carry one myself. They consist of these huge batteries
Yep.
that are, gosh, you can't even fly with them. And my brain is shutting down on the type of battery, but they're huge. And then it has the instrument in the hard drive. And so I think we're still using that hydrophone in this area, but it's kind of cumbersome to work with. Like you have to attach it to a mooring. In order to deploy the mooring, you need to have a big ship with an A-frame. And so my advisor, Kate Stafford, is actually moving more towards sound traps, which are smaller. And I think you can just toss them over the side of a ship. They're far more manageable.
Yeah. Like you mean ones with the cable? Because I remember Dave Sheffield brought one of those ones that looked like a microphone. Remember, Gay?
Yeah, absolutely.
Back in the day.
Yeah.
I remember that.
Got lots of sound.
Oh,
Yep.
cool.
So with the the hydrophone, the oral M2, how many kilometers away can you hear whale sounds or ship sounds?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, like I said, I haven't been able to do really robust analysis of sound propagation because you need to have data on how sound speed travels through the sediment, but other studies have done that. And also like, you can do triangulation studies where if you have multiple recorders and you hear a call at point A, and then you hear a call at point B, like a few minutes later, and a call at point C, even shorter amount of time, you could kind of triangulate where in space where that animal is and figure out detection ranges that way. Or you can do the sound propagation modeling. And so we assumed for fin whales that fin whales within 10 to 20 kilometers at maximum on good days where sound was able to propagate far 30 kilometers around our hydrophone, that we were able to hear fin whales. But fin whales have really low frequency calls that are able to travel really far distances. And so it's likely that gray whales, which make those kind of softer sounds, lower and the higher frequencies, are probably have a shorter detection range. So I don't know exactly, but I guess between 10 to 20 kilometers away.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Wow.
Hmm.
Yep, maybe because for the fin whales, the shipping noises, they cause vibrations, in the ocean.
Hmm.
And, those can even scare off fish too. So,
Yes, yes, fish
yeah.
are sensitive to yeah, I think like lower frequencies. Yeah, and we don't know how whales hear, but we know the frequency of sounds they make, and we can infer that, okay, like fin whales make calls in the 20 hertz, 20 to 100 hertz range, and that's right about where most of the noise that ships produce, especially bigger ships, produce a lot of noise in those frequency bands. So we can assume that that probably bothers fin whales. Yeah.
Hmm.
There, I
Wow.
just, so we can see you, so Opa can
Oh,
see you,
great.
because you
Perfect.
know
Yeah.
each other. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, thanks. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Can I have your email address, or is it somewhere on the flyer? I posted up your flyer all over, hoping more diamond
Oh.
people would pop in, but nobody else has working Starlinks.
Yeah, that is a limiting factor.
I can send it
Yep.
to you, Opic, if Erica doesn't want to put it in the chat. That's easy peasy.
Oh, I could put it in the chat too. That's
Okay, yeah,
easy.
throw it in the
Yeah.
chat.
Okay.
The other question I have is, is your hydrophone or whoever your NOAA, are
Mhm.
they having that A3 hydrophone and other hydrophones in the area over the course of this winter? Do you know if they have hydrophones listening now? And the reason I ask
Yeah.
you is because the Northern Sea Route has been very inactive
Mm.
this year for vessels. So we have not seen traffic coming across for the entire winter. That would have AIS. I'm sure there's probably military or other vessels that they have that they are not maybe lighting up. But it looks like, for the most part, there's really been no traffic. The other thing is, Rootin' Tootin' Putin has announced that starting in 2024, the Northern Sea Route will be open 12 months of the year for, I think they're starting off for the 975-foot liquid natural gas carriers. So the
Mm.
really big ones. There's not a ton of them. I think there's about 14 or 15 of those that they're using for liquid natural gas. And I'm just wondering what a perfect experiment you have if your equipment or your agency's equipment is currently there. We will have if it's active, you'll have a year before we go into 12 months operation with very minimal ship noise, which we've experienced this winter, and to see what some of the behaviors and timing and whatnot of the whales would be super interesting. I think you're sitting on so
Yeah.
I was just wondering, do you know if those moorings have hydrophones on them that are active this year?
That's a good question. I'm not
Okay.
100% sure. It's an easy thing to check. I'll just look at Rebecca Woodgate always publishes her trip reports from servicing the moorings
Right.
each summer, and she always includes what instruments were included so that I can get back to you on whether
Okay.
or not. But yeah,
I mean, that's a science project already done if you guys have your recording out.
yeah, no, it's true. But that's crazy that they're sending ships year round. I mean, that's
Yep.
Yeah.
And then my other question is, how do you tell? Honestly, I've never seen a fin whale, and I don't know when historically the first fin whales, and you have online many of world-class experts on whales right here on this line for the Bering Strait. We're on this platform for the Bering Strait region. So, to me, humpbacks went north into the Chukchi. For my limited knowledge, I was asked questions around 2006. People were asking about humpback whales. The first time I ever heard about a fin whale was from people in Utqiagvik. And I'm just wondering, do you know when the gray whales, yeah, we see them more and more going north, but are you familiar? Or
Yeah.
like I say, we've got experts on the line here, but for the fin whale, And I don't
Mhm.
know even what the diagnostic, what we look for to determine, that's a fin whale when we're looking at something.
Yes.
And then
Yeah.
when would humpback go through? When is this, when did they start making these forays into the north? Like you say, to me, it was like, are they coming back home? This is normal because their populations have come up
Mhm.
over time, or is this really a reaction to the prey?
Yeah.
change?
Well, so there are a few questions there. So I
Yeah,
start to
sorry.
see, no, it's okay. Yeah,
Okay.
I'll try to answer them as best I
You
can.
got a lot up. My brain was spinning. Yeah.
I know. That's good. That's good. That means that I did my job. So I start to see, gray whales are first. They go through the strait in May, typically, that I saw in the only 4 years of data I saw. I had spring detections. Humpback whales, I started hearing them around June. So like June 1st, around E3, I started seeing the first humpback whale calls. And then fin whales were typically later in June, early July was when I started to see them. And so, yeah, there's been observations like the aerial survey data starting in 2008 saw humpbacks and fin whales, I mean, throughout the south, definitely in the southern Chukchi Sea, a little bit in the northeast Chukchi Sea, kind of in between Cape Lisburn and Wainwright. Not as much, like there are very few whales that go up that region. And then, yeah, like was that observation of humpback whales east of Utiavik. And yeah, you told me about the sighting of, or a dead fin whale that washed up, right?
Definitely. Yeah. This
Yeah,
year.
yeah, this year. So, they are
Last
expanding their
22 fall.
yeah. And
Yeah.
so what's interesting is, historically we have a ton of observations of both species off the coast of Chukotka from the Soviet whalers that were operating in that region, Japanese whalers later in the 1930s and 40s, but very few observations on the eastern side of the Chukchi Sea, very few historical. And so were they just not there? Have they kind of expanded to the eastern side of the Chukchi Sea? It's unclear just because we don't have the same kind of observations that we do from the whalers.
So the fin whales and humpback whales were here in the being taken commercially.
Yeah.
Okay, so they are returning. I did not know
Yeah.
that. Thank you very much.
Yeah. So yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
And then how do you find a fin whale? What's the diagnostic? If I'm looking, what am I looking for that would say, fin whale, other than being 80 feet long or something?
Right. Other than being big. Yeah, basically, from a distance, it'd be difficult to tell the difference between like a humpback whale and fin whale, but a fin whale spout is just much taller and much more narrow than a humpback. And also typically you would see the spout and the fin first, like at the same time. Yeah.
Okay.
And so they have very different fins. Humpbacks have that distinctive hump and then their dorsal fin, whereas fin whales have that kind of like fulcate dolphin looking fin. But they're kind of, I don't want to call them boring, but they don't have any surface activity. They don't do any lobbying or tail lobbying. They hardly show their flukes. So they're not as dynamic.
Are they fast?
They're very fast.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes.
And they swim in groups? Do they swim together?
They do.
I mean,
yeah.
here's what I mean, because like humpback whales, they're like alone most of the time, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, humpback whales will social feed, so they will get together, and
With the
in
young,
other
yep.
Yeah, and in other places of Alaska, they will get together and bubble net feed together as a team. But in those cases, they're chasing down herring, which might require such coordinated efforts between multiple individuals. I don't know if we're seeing those kind of groupings north of the strait. I did read in that Brower paper that I shared with you all that humpbacks and fin whales do seem to occur in close association with each other. So if you see a humpback whale, there might be a fin whale nearby. And I know that from personal experience, actually, the only fin and humpback whale I've seen and was in the northern Bering Sea, just north of St. Lawrence, and I saw humpback whales and fin whales feeding close together. So, but yeah, kind of back to your question, Gabe, like whether they're returning, I kind of have this hypothesis that, because I spent a lot of time thinking about how these whales find their food and how do they know the foraging areas. And so a whale, when it's born, the first foraging area it visits is with its mother. And so it's going to go, that it knows that that's a good foraging area. And so it's likely that they'll return to that foraging area the next year once they're independent from their mother. And so when we had a really intensive whaling effort in the North Pacific that removed individuals from the population, my hypothesis is that we could have removed all the individuals that knew about this feeding area and knew that it existed and knew that if you just swam a little farther, went past St. Lawrence Island, continued following the currents, there was really good feeding opportunities north of the Bering Strait. And so it took time for whales to kind of stray from the regular feeding areas in the Bering Sea to rediscover those feeding areas in the Chukchi Sea. And then now we're seeing that they've recovered and they're recovering their extent of their former ranges before we removed thousands of them. So that's my hypothesis. So
All right. No, that's really interesting. Thank you very much.
And the fin whales, they migrate from California up through Alaska to the Chukchi, and no one knows where they go afterwards.
yeah,
I mean,
well, yeah, we don't know if that would be fascinating. I would love to be able to do some genetic sampling, maybe even do eDNA or whatnot to just figure out where these whales are coming from, because fin whales, there is a population that's found along the coast of California, but I read once that could just be a resident population that spends most of the year in the California current and then doesn't really travel anywhere else to feed. And so if I were to guess, my guess is that they probably are coming from like a breeding area around Hawaii, but we don't know. It's a mystery. So
they eat them in Iceland.
oh, they do, yeah.
I think those might be minke.
Or yeah, minke.
No, it was
Yeah.
fin whale.
Fin
I had
whale.
fin whale.
All right.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Done.
Maybe they migrate there up through that way and down. I mean,
Yeah, well,
over.
Could be.
yeah, there. Yeah, I mean, my guess is that maybe not. I mean, bowhead whales have certainly made that journey between the Pacific and the Atlantic Arctic, but they're a little braver when it comes to sea ice. They're far more comfortable with sea ice than at least North Pacific fin whales are. But yeah, you never know, especially with the ice disappearing more and more, what could happen.
Thank you, Opik. And there
Thank
is
you.
a question in the chat from Susan Apasinguk, and she's wondering where can we get those hydrophones? And I think, Susan, that you mean like there's the industrial size. So the kind that Erica was using needs a ship with a crane and a A-frame, but there are, the Bering Strait region is so technologically hip. I went to Gamble years and years ago, and I went up to Mr. Ungit, Mr. Ontagami, and I think Mr. Apangaluk, and they were all listening in on a little tiny hydrophone system that they had. And I don't know, are you thinking of the big industrial size? You want the name of that, or something that's more easy to transport for sort of everyday use for a person? But the question for you, Erica, is where can we get those hydrophones that you were talking about? Or do you have a recommended sort of smaller version as well for people?
Yes. So those hydrophones, I think you can order them from Oral. I'll type it into the
Okay, cool.
the chat, but it's a Oral M2 hydrophone. And
smaller, she says, the
smaller. Okay. So the smaller one that my advisor is now using are called sound traps. I don't know who the manufacturer of them is, and what the price ranges are. But I can, if you're interested in deploying smaller hydrophones that you're able to get back
Personal use.
yourself for personal use, if you want to give me your contact information, I can reach out to a colleague that I know who is doing acoustic studies of belugas, who can deploy them over the side of a small boat. And so I can get the model and price and make and all that kind of information for you, Susan, if you're interested.
You
So,
bet. You can
yeah.
you can either get a hold of Susan if she puts her contact info in the chat, or you can get a hold of me and I can send
Okay.
it out.
Yeah, I'll
to
do
her.
that. Yeah.
All right. Well, geez, Erica, we're over the 7:30 mark and you're hanging in there. So thank you for taking all these questions. The caller's still hanging in. If you have any questions, caller, just feel free to blurt them out. And there, Susan's giving you her
Awesome.
email address so you guys can connect on that.
Perfect.
And I think we have all the, so many experts in the Bering Strait region with such a history and knowledge for the animals, especially the whales here. Would NOAA, as they go forward into more studies on this, would they start to engage with our local communities and maybe learn from what people here have experienced or are seeing with the marine resources here?
Yeah, I would hope so. Yeah, I
Yeah.
think it would be wonderful, just to collect some of these personal observations of these whales, and get the timing and ID. That would be fantastic. And I don't know what the future holds for me. This was my PhD work, but if I do get the opportunity to continue looking at this question, that would definitely be a top priority for me.
Wonderful.
So, yeah.
Great. Thank you. Because there's a lot of information right here on this. Got to let Opic back in. She jumped out by accident. Must be the Starlink.
Yeah.
There's a lot of information in the Bering Strait region that is certainly should be incorporated and celebrated. So we thank you for your work as well. And Orland does write, it would be nice to have a smaller portable hydrophone for when I go boating.
Fishing?
And he also says, people put a wooden oar in the water behind the ear, and you can hear the sound that way from the bearded seal.
Oh yeah.
Bearded seal and other animals. So I used to have, what Opic was referring to was, I used to travel with a very small hydrophone. The can was about, this big, with a cord, and we just plugged it into a old battery operated tape deck, and it would play. We would let it record. We'd all not move, because you could hear the footsteps on the ice. And we were teaching the smaller children how noisy when men are hunting, like don't take your snow machine out on the ice or anything, because they're trying to be quiet. Oh yeah, thank you. Susan put
So cool.
a picture of them boating, the size of the boat. So something that would be useful for something like that. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I can look into that for you. No problem.
Okay,
Thank you so
wonderful.
much.
Yeah, I think hydrophones are something we all should be carrying, honestly, when you're out boating.
Yes.
It's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun.
Absolutely. And it would be very easy then to put together a very, straightforward paper of just what you're hearing, detections, when and where, that kind of thing would be fascinating.
All right. With no other questions, going once, going twice, we're going to have straight science next. We're not going to have straight science next week. We're going to have straight science next on June 15th, and it's going to be Sabrina Garcia with ADF&G, and she's going to be talking about her new research results on salmon sharks. And so she is also a returning speaker, and she's got her project results. She put out some more tags on salmon sharks that are in our area. So we're really excited that she wants to come back and let us know what she's learned about salmon sharks in the northern Bering Sea and further north as well. So stay tuned. A lot's changing as we speak to have a second straight science on sharks in our region. We're kind of excited to hear what she she's found and what they're learning about that. And it looks like, if you can let me know too, the hydrophone you now recommend for personal use, and I can make
Yeah.
sure like Orland gets that. There's some things in the chat.
Yeah.
about-
Yeah, I'll
So
send it to you as
wonderful.
well. Awesome.
With that, I would say we'll see you not next week, but June 15th for Salmon Sharks. Thank you so much, Erica. Stay on for 1 second and we'll say
Okay.
goodnight to everybody.
Thank
Have a good
you.
night, everyone.